He sat on a low bench near his house and stared as if he were looking through walls. The emptiness in his eyes was not indifference. It was fatigue, measured in hours that could not be counted. People talked about returning after what had happened to him, but no one explained what it meant to return to a morning when your hands tremble at the sound and your breath feels sharp as the edge of a knife. He sat silently, and the world around him pretended that this was normal. The grass grew, the starling chirped, the postman walked down the street calling out names he no longer recognized as his own. On the table next to him was a cup of cold coffee. It had been there for an hour, and its steam, once a ritual, hung in the air like an unanswered question. The emptiness in his eyes reflected more than just a lack of sleep. It reflected a whole library of silences, messages he couldn't write, letters he didn't dare to open, speeches that remained stuck in his throat because the words weighed too much. Sometimes it seemed to him that memory was compulsory literature that had to be reread endlessly until his skills failed him. He was dressed simply: jeans with dirt stains, a sweater that long lost its color, and shoes that knew every sidewalk in the city. His hands, mostly calm, sometimes twitched at the slightest sound: a door closing, a dog barking, a bus whistle. And with each twitch, he seemed to remember something important and terrible, an echo of the night he wanted to forget. He tried not to think. On days like this, thoughts were like angry birds. If you let them go, they would start pecking at your face. So he learned to stare at the same brick in the fence until his contours softened, until his thoughts ran out on their own. It wasn't healing. It was a cannula through which he fed himself hour after hour. When she appeared, he initially mistook her for another neighbor. She was walking down the path with a small pot in her hands, wearing a worn robe that smelled of earth. Her steps were quiet, like someone who was used to talking to plants more than to people. She stopped nearby, making no noticeable effort to break his silence. "Good afternoon," she said, as if it were the beginning of a long habit, not the first sentence. There was no spark of drama in her voice. It was a simple thing. A proposal. "I grow desert seedlings. Could I ask you for one small thing?" He looked up. It seemed that, at that moment, something new flashed across his face. Not hope in its pure form, but an interest that smelled like his cold coffee. A little bitter, a little warm. "What is it?" he finally asked, his voice not as rough as he thought it would be. She looked at him directly, as if choosing her words carefully, like a family doctor. And then, without any fanfare, she said, "Your hat, the one you never take off. I want it in exchange for lessons in restraint." At that moment, his face changed. The hat, which until now had lived on his head and was more a part of his body than clothing, suddenly took on weight, memories, history, baggage. And he understood. If he gave it away, he would be giving away more than just wool. He would be giving away a piece of himself that had grown accustomed to hiding under the fabric. But alongside this realization, there was another, quieter thought. What if by giving away what kept him in the dark, he could learn to breathe again? The night was all metal and moisture. The light from the lanterns flickered unevenly, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in his pockets like an old, harsh memory. He remembered every sound of that night as clearly as he now remembered the trembling of his own hands, the whistle of a bullet over his head like a sharp thread, the rumble that came from afar and grew closer, and then an explosion that shattered the silence, as if someone had torn open a large black tent. They stood in a field that seemed endless, but was in fact only a piece of a forgotten road. The muzzle of the Kalashnikov in his palms and the earth beneath his feet echoing. The cold seeped into his boots, and the wind blew dust that stuck to his wet face. His brother, a few years younger, with cheeks that had not yet been hardened by the ravages of war, stood nearby and laughed very quietly. It was a laugh that tried to break the terrible current of fear that was pulling everyone down. "Hang in there," said his brother, and the words were as simple as a spoonful of food on a hungry morning. They exchanged a brief glance. There was little fear in his brother's eyes, but a lot of determination. There were words that did not need to be spoken because they meant more than any command. When the shooting started, everything happened in an instant. First the shot, then the light that tore through the night like lightning, and the feeling that the ground had shaken slightly beneath his feet. He felt something rush up his spine, adrenaline or fear. He couldn't tell. Then his brother's shoulders fell on him, and a hand pressed his head tightly to his chest. There was a metallic taste in his mouth, and he realized he couldn't breathe because of the noise and explosions. Then his brother tore off his balaclava. It was a simple thing. Coarse wool, a few threads sticking out, traces of soot. His brother quickly took it off and handed it to him as if he were handing over the most important thing in the world. "Put it on," he whispered. His voice was dry, but there was warmth in it, a small truth that appears in the midst of chaos and says, "Live." He put on the hat as mechanically as one puts on gloves. It covered not only his face, but also his ears and part of his heart. The wool stuck to his skin. It was coarse, but warm. Inside there was a slight smell, smoke, oil from his brother's fingers, and something else that reminded him of childhood, the sweet smell of cookies that his mother used to bake for bedtime. Even now, years later, that smell would come back to him at the most unexpected moments and tear his heart in two, pain and fond memories. The explosions rolled in one after another. Someone shouted, someone fell, someone began to lie down as if asleep. He felt cold beneath his chest, and suddenly the place where the pain should have been was filled with an empty sound, as if he himself had become a bell. His brother lay next to him, his face turned toward the sky. His breathing was shallow and short, but he was laughing. It seemed that even in this there was some kind of visible joke. "Don't let them break you," his brother whispered through clenched teeth, and the word was broken but firm. He tried to answer, but the words stuck in his throat like ice. He could still see that face, eyes shining, lips trembling, and in that tremor there was something that left no doubt about how much he loved him. The last thing he remembered before everything went white was his brother's hand grabbing his shoulder and pulling him closer. The silence seemed long and heavy, and then something happened that need not be described in detail here. A sound, a blow, and then coldness. Everything was muffled, but even through the silence, he could feel the texture of wool on his face and breathe in his brother's scent. Then the smell of blood. Then voices, other bodies, and his own fingers searching for a pulse like a guide in the fog. He felt his brother's fingers warmed for another moment. Then they became softer, like wax. His brother's eyes were looking somewhere far away, and there was something in them that could be called farewell. He didn't scream. He didn't know how to scream. Instead, he held the cap so tightly as if it were the only bridge between him and that warm laughter. And when the medics began to find people, carry them away, and when the whole scattered world began to gather in ambulances, he sat on the cold ground and held this ball of wool in his hands, which somehow gave him stability, not from physical strength, but from a memory that was stronger than pain. That night, the hat became more than just a hat. It became a sign, a quiet and silent seal of everything that was left unsaid. It was a fragile thread between what was and what remained. When he was later brought home, when light returned to the streets, the hat remained with him. He did not take it off at night because under it was lost what was too bitter to allow himself to remember aloud. And long after that night, when he was getting used to the ordinary things in life, how to make tea, how to get out of bed, how to respond to simple greetings, That hat was his silent companion. When someone asked him why it was important, he had only one answer. It smelled of the night and his brother's laughter. It was what kept him from drowning completely. And sometimes, in special moments, when he thought he was about to break, he would take it out and press it to his face. And the smell came back to life, and so did the memory. That whirlwind of the night was engraved in him like a scar on a tree. You can't cut it off. You can only learn to live with it. And the hat became the first piece of that new fabric.
He was still holding that lump of wool when she returned to him with the pot. Her hands were dark with soil, as if she had just dug up something in the world that others had forgotten. There was no mercy on her face, only a calm, present warmth that didn't ask for permission. "Sit closer," she said, and her voice did not ask, but offered a place in the world. He wiped his eyes with his palm as if it were more natural than responding with words, and sat down on the bench. They sat like that for a while, as if checking to see if their world would disappear in the next moment. Somewhere in the yard, a swing swayed. The sound of its creaking was imperceptible but necessary, a reminder that simple things were still alive. Maryana placed the pot between them, leaned over, and without looking up, sniffed, as if checking the smell of the day. Then she smiled as if she were happy about some small victory. "I know," she said, a little harshly, "that you have doubts. Many people have doubts, but I ask you not to imagine big things right now. Let's start with breathing." Breathing. How many people talk about it but don't know how to make it simple? He supposedly knew how to breathe. They all know. But she asked him to close his eyes and listen. He laughed briefly. The laughter barely touched the air, and closed his eyes because it was easier. "Breathe in for 3, she led, as if you were lifting a cup of warm coffee. Breathe out for 6, as if you were giving the warmth back to the earth. Don't think about the night, just count." He clenched his teeth and began to count. 1. Inhale. 2. The feeling of air passing through his collar. 3. The tension squeezing his chest. Exhale. On 6, the same thread that was pulling him down, letting go not immediately, but at least a little. For the first time in a long time, he felt a different rhythm entering his body, not as a command, but simply as a possibility. "Now imagine," she said quietly, "that you are exhaling not only air, but also a piece of what is pulling you down. A small piece. Not the whole load, just a piece." It seemed pointless to him to draw pieces of pain with his thoughts, but somehow it worked. The air came out, and with it came a little heaviness. He opened his eyes and saw a drop of sweat on his palms, not from physical labor, but from internal labor, which had finally become something he could do with his hands. The first lesson was about breathing. The second was about the earth. She gave him a small spoon, something old that looked like it had been held by other hands before him. She placed the pot on his empty knee and simply said, "Plant." "Plant what?" he asked, and in his voice there was the same thing as in his childhood, the desire for an answer. "Plant faith," she replied, "or at least a seed. It's the same thing." They worked slowly. She showed him how to make a small hole where the seed goes, how to gently press down the soil. Her hands were firm, but her movements were gentle, just like those who had lifted the crumbs of life many times before. He looked at her fingers, at the traces of soil under her nails, and suddenly felt that this was work for his hands. He dipped the spoon and felt the soil crumble between his fingers, like a different texture, a different reality than the one that lived in his head. She didn't say much about what was to come. She gave him exercises. Water, but not too much. Turn the soil with a spoon once a week, and say one word out loud every morning. He laughed when he heard the last one. Say a word? Because he felt uncomfortable saying simple things out loud again. But Maryana stood nearby, her presence itself a permission. "What word?" he asked. "Any word that means life to you. When I first said this, people started with love, children, freedom. You have your own word. Save in the morning when you bring your cup of tea, and see what happens." The next morning he said the word, not with dignity, not with conviction, but as people do when they try something for the first time, hesitantly. The word sounded in the silence of the kitchen. And then he was surprised. The cup gave off heat not only to his fingers, but also further, in his chest. It was a small miracle. In the early days, a lot went wrong. He forgot to water it. He spilled water and wondered where it all came from. And once, when he felt his heart making those familiar leaps again, he took a bite of bread and laughed at himself. The laughter was small and cautious, but noticeable. Maryana, who came almost every day, knew how to sweep away his doubts with one word: try again. She had a gift for seeing glimmers of hope where others saw emptiness. Once he came to her angry because of a night that awakened old ghosts in him. She listened to him silently, tilting her head slightly, then handed him a cup of herbal tea and said, "Sometimes you need to drink tea and not make any big plans." And he drank, and that was a lesson. Don't always fight the storm, sometimes just wait it out with a cup in your hands. Between breathing and potty training, there was another small task. He had to write one sentence of gratitude every evening. That was the hardest part. Gratitude felt like betrayal in the first few weeks, like acknowledging warmth when you felt like winter inside. But he wrote, for the spoon that fell while he was working, for his neighbor's laughter, for the sun that appeared without warning one morning. And with each line, he felt a new muscle emerge within him, the muscle to see the little things. Was it a miracle? No, it was work. But there was a sacred truth in that work. Small actions performed aloud and by hand restored his ability to be in the world. And when he went outside for the first time in a month and didn't feel like screaming from what he had been through, he realized that he was no longer just one step on the way. And at that moment, as the sun was setting, Maryana sat down next to him and said, "Tomorrow we'll start with another lesson. Don't be afraid." He responded not with words, but with a gesture. He took a spoon and pressed a dark lump of earth with his fingers. And that was his answer. Silent, but sufficient.
The series of lessons began not as a course, but as life, broken down into small tasks. Each day brought a new exercise and a new mistake that taught more than any victory. 1. First watering. He thought watering was easy. Pour water and walk away, just as he thought breathing was easy. On the first morning, when Maryana gave him a watering can, he turned his pot into a small river. Water flowed across the floor, collecting in a puddle nearby. The soil turned to mush, and the seed that was supposed to sprout began to ferment from the excess moisture. He stood bent over, looking at the muddy ground and feeling shame spread through his body. I ruined everything, he thought. His throat tightened, and that old voice in his head whispered, "There you go again. You can't do it." He wanted to hide the spoon, take off his hat, and hide again. Maryana jumped up, not with reproach, but with a touch of irony that he had already begun to love. "You've made an ocean," she said, "but the seed won't float away. Add some soil, and then water it like this. Don't think about the amount, think about the touch." She demonstrated the movement, not with a cup, but with a lightning-fast watering can, a light rain falling on the leaves. He tried again, slowly, like a drop afraid to break. The water fell gently, the earth swallowed it silently, and in the morning when he approached, a small sprout sat on a thin green line, thin as a thread, but alive. 2. Movement and rhythm. Physical work was unexpectedly like directing a body that had long forgotten how to speak the language of movement. Maryana taught him to lift the bucket not as a punishment, but as a dance step. Sway a little, keep your back straight, place your foot so that your knee does not twist. Her instructions were simple and a little funny, like, imagine you're carrying tea for the queen, not an iron can. And that laughter saved him more than pills. For the first time since he left the hospital, he climbed the stairs without help. Not the whole flight, but a few steps. His heart was pounding in his chest like a drum. His legs were shaking like a concert in a game. And then he heard a whistle, a siren from the road. His chest tightened again. His hands went numb. Memories like sharp fish jumped at him, and he felt that the world could fall apart again. Maryana approached quietly. Without questions, she grabbed his shoulders, looked into his eyes, and said quietly, "Breathe. 3-6. I'm here." He took a breath, then another. Her voice was like a rope he could grab onto. After a minute, he would remember for the rest of his life. His heart stopped pounding like a hammer. He got up again, and when his neighbor, who had seen him from the window, shouted, "Oh, you're coming," he even smiled. The smile was a small victory, but it was real. 3. Conflict in the public sphere. A few weeks later, Maryana suggested that he demonstrate one of the simple rituals at a local volunteer gathering, a short presentation on how routine saves lives. He agreed because he felt that he was beginning to belong to something bigger. The scene was simple: a table, a few pots, people in jackets holding cups of tea. He talked about breathing while demonstrating the movements. Inhale, like lifting a cup. Exhale, like giving it back. People listened. Some nodded, some took notes. Then a man stood up and commented, "But you know these are fairy tales, right? Treatment is done by doctors, not paddles." An old skeptic in the city. He is convinced that everything has a clear explanation without systems and rituals. Something ignited inside Alexei, a feeling of injustice that he remembered well from his time in the barracks. He began to respond, his voice rising, and a wave of old anger flooded him. He's always been like that, he thought. The same one who says, "I wonder whose heart needs to be broken to calm down." Maryana touched his hand, gently, and said, "Don't get angry. Give him the soil. Plant with him. You'll see. Maybe he'll change." He stopped. This simple step, not letting him respond but inviting him to work, became one of her systematic tricks. And when he left, taking the skeptic by the hand to the pot, and the latter, although initially resistant, lowered the spoon into the ground and was forced to keep his hands busy, something in him softened. 4. Night ghosts and letters. One evening, after a month of persistent practice, he sat down and tried to complete the task that Maryana had set as special: to write a letter to his brother. Not a letter of grief, not a reproach, just a word of thanks and a phrase that could come up in conversation as if they were sitting next to each other at the table. The first sentence required all his strength. He wrote and erased, wrote and threw away. Then one night his dreams brought him back to that explosion. He woke up trembling, gradually losing his grip on reality. His hand instinctively grabbed his hat, and when the trembling did not subside, he took the notebook with the beginning of the letter from under the bed, opened it, and continued. The words flowed like heartbeats. "You laughed when the stars fell." And it was this small, memorable sentence that prompted another. "You taught me to hold on." When he read the letter out loud to Maryana in the morning, his voice sounded strange to him, weak, but finally truthful. She listened, and there were tears in her eyes, but not tears of pity, tears of joy that he had allowed himself to speak. This was not a one-time rescue. It was a step toward freeing himself from the trap of memory. Finally, he took his hat and placed it on a chair nearby. He wasn't ready to throw it away for good yet, but for the first time in his life, he could look at it without panic. It remained a part of his history, but it was no longer his only shield. In the evening, Maryana stood by the sprouts in the light that scattered across the leaves. He approached and placed his spoon next to hers. She nodded and smiled subtly. "You're not ready yet, but you're ready enough to lead." She didn't say it as a reward, she said it as a fact. In these small scenes, in these minor mistakes, and even smaller victories, a new pattern began to emerge. He didn't become a different person in a week. He just learned to take steps, and each step had more power than words alone. To start again.
She was not a sorceress. She was a person who had learned to count the days by silly little things. How many times she had poured tea before it was ready. How many nights she had to wait for the roots to take hold. How many times she had to say a word before it stopped sounding foreign. Maryana grew up in a place where the land often taught harsh lessons. Her parents kept a small garden on the edge of the village, and she remembered learning as a child to put her hand in the ground without fear of thorns. Her mother knew how to turn crumbs into a hearty dinner. A few potatoes, a little craftsmanship, and the table was full. So her first school was simple and practical. If you want something to grow, don't wait for a miracle. Do the work every day. The memory of her mother's hands, warm with rough calluses, was her first teacher. She remembered how her mother whispered over each sprout, "Don't rush, let the roots find their way." These were not grandiose words. It was another form of love, quiet, daily care. Maryana understood that many things in life are not solved with grand speeches. They are solved with a spoonful of soil, daily watering, and that same meager ritual of gratitude, which she saw everywhere as a magical exercise. Then there was something else, pain, which taught her a different kind of patience. When her husband died and her son was still young, her world seemed torn to pieces. There was no time for mourning, no strength for despair. She had to feed her child, pay for medicine, and simply give herself the opportunity not to break down. She remembers the night when the cat's cries outside the window were louder than her thoughts, and for the first time in her life, she felt that ritual could replace prayer. She took an old pot, sowed seeds in it, and when she saw a sprout in the morning, her heart responded for a moment, a small but real miracle. It was not healing in the grand sense. It was the simple, crude logic of life, a small action, a small result, a little more hope. And Maryana decided to devote herself to this craft, to help those who have little strength, to show them how to breathe, how to plant, how to do things and not be afraid of mistakes. She learned from her mistakes that you can't rush time, that you shouldn't try to convince people to change if they're not ready, that working with the body starts with working with consistency. Her yard didn't immediately become the quiet center that it is now. At first, it was a small shelter, a couple of pots, an old water barrel, a few chairs. She welcomed people without advertising, just a quiet kitchen, a cup of herbal tea, and a notebook with names where she noted not diagnoses but small signs: who forgets to eat, whose hands shake, who can't laugh. Her approach was not certified, it was based solely on practice, breathing, movement, small tasks. She did not charge for this. "My price is not in money," she said. "It will be something you are willing to give from your heart." That is why she asked for the hat, not because she wanted to collect things, but because her method was based on another simple idea. When a person gives away something dear to them, they take the first step toward others. By giving away the thing that served as his shield, the veteran gave himself permission to receive the tools he needed for life. It wasn't a trade, it was a deal with his own soul. I am ready to give up my protection in order to learn to trust. Maryana knew that the material price didn't work that deeply. An item with meaning opened the door to inner work. Her past had taught her another simple truth. Laughter and tea are also methods. She knew how to make tea so that it not only warmed the throat, but also warmed memories. She knew how to ask questions so that they didn't hurt in the morning, but gave space for answers. She learned to listen as if each person had their own little map of pain, and sometimes it was enough to share a spoonful of earth to make that map smaller. There were nights when her hands grew tired, when she cried quietly after someone couldn't continue. She remembered how the feeling of helplessness came, and each time she answered herself with what she wrote in her notebook: one word of gratitude every day. It wasn't a motivational phrase, it was a system. And the system worked because people came back. Gradually, her home turned into an almost invisible hub of help. Quiet people who planted seeds, learned to breathe, brought tiny gifts: a jar of jam, a spool of thread, homemade bread. Once, when she was remembering her husband, she found his handwriting in her notebook, the short word, "Hold on." She laughed, sometimes through tears, because she understood that sometimes working with people is a continuation of a conversation they didn't have time to finish. And that was another reason why she did what she did. Her actions were part of the communication she was not able to complete with those she had lost. That is why she asked for the hat, not because she wanted for the hat, but because for the dialogue. And now, standing by Alexei's bench, her eyes shined with the same quiet, ironic sparkle that lit up her small yard. "Let's have some rules," she said, not as a command, but as a suggestion. "You give, I give." And when he agreed, she saw not only risk in his eyes, but also the same readiness that she once had when she first planted seeds at night without any guarantees. In her hands, every piece of skin, every stem, every cup was a chance for change. And she knew that sometimes people don't need big, encouraging words, but small deeds that bring the essence back into the body. That is why she was here. That is why she asked for a hat. The hot summer arrived in the town without warning. The air was heavy like a wet woolen blanket, and every morning began with the ground cracking underfoot. Maryana left the house before the sun rose above the rooftops and walked through the garden with a bucket in her hands, like a nurse with a syringe. She checked every pot, caught dry leaves, mulched the delicate roots with sawdust, and saved what could still be saved. She spoke quietly, as always. Care is fuel, and there was more force in her voice than one would expect from a woman in a worn robe. His garden was the first to respond to the drought, the very sprouts that had broken through thanks to the first lesson. The leaves began to curl, the soil peeled away from the sides of the pot, and a white salt crust appeared on the necks of the buckets. He stood there, looking at it, and felt as if he were looking at a map of his despair. If the pot dried up, what else inside it would dry up with it? "We have to save water," Maryana said that morning. "Don't water unless you have to. Collect water from the morning squeeze, from the kettle on the table. Every drop counts." They started a system: buckets under the rain gutters, bowls under the air conditioners, dishes from the sink for washing. People in the yard brought jars, the jars turned into reservoirs, and the town started talking about how to survive without rain. It was practical poetry, simple actions that created a thread of community. But water is not just a liquid. It was also an idea that people lacked. When neighbors began to argue over the right to water 2 more bushes than someone else, he felt old demons creeping up on him, memories of the night when water and everything else became a matter of life and death.
He clutched the spoon in his pocket as if it were his only support. And then, like a bolt from the blue, Sergei appeared in the yard, one of those old comrades who are sometimes whispered about. He did not look festive. An old jacket that smelled of smoke, a face creased with wrinkles that could easily be read as a map of hardship. He did not rush to shake hands. He stood, listened, and finally said, "I hear you're teaching children here. Is that right?" His voice was sharp as a stone. He nodded, and at that moment, two stories converged in their eyes. One about salvation, the other about the long road back that had not yet been traveled. Sergei raised his head, looking at the dried flowers, and his voice seemed to soften. "They say you gave up your hat. I thought you were haunted by the memory that you had to defend it. But you took a different path." There were more questions than statements in this. Sergei believed that silence was armor. Now he saw that sometimes something else was needed. He did not come for shelter. He came for a witness. The first few minutes of their conversation were silent. Then Sergei stretched out his hand and asked for a bucket. Silently, as in the army, when words are unnecessary, Alexei handed him a watering can, and Sergei began to work. His movements were rough but focused. When he bent down to water, when, for the first time in many years, he did so not in the midst of battle, but in a peaceful garden, a new shadow passed over his face. At first, he did not speak. Then, when the bucket was getting lighter, he said quietly, "I forgot how to hold something alive. Thank you." It was a small breakthrough, and at the same time, a test. Would they be able to overcome not only the drought of the land, but also the drought of trust between people? Because in the drought, every little thing became a big reason for quarrels. Someone was better at collecting water in the new system. Someone forgot to return the canister, and between these shortcomings, tension raged. One evening, a group of people came to Maryana with a request. "Help us with the well. It's clogged. We can't control the queue." They stood there, heavy with the heat, empty vessels in their hands. Maryana gave the order without hesitation. "We'll start early tomorrow. Distribution, shifts. You will show who can fix the lid. We will unite." And this simple organization was the magic of a larger kind. It gave people back a sense of shared control. Meanwhile, Sergei began to visit more and more often. He brought stories about what it was like at the front, but not in assessments and loud memories, but in small moments. How he shared a mug with a friend during the night watch, how they touched the same ball of bread smell. These stories, short, sometimes funny, gently rocked the tense strings. He still had trouble understanding, was grumpy, but his presence was already more useful than empty. But the ordeal did not end with the pressure of the people. On one of the hottest days, the water was turned off in the town for several hours due to a system failure. When the tap was supposed to come back on, the crowd of people lined up with even greater tension. Some people panicked. Some decided to grab more than they needed. Fear appeared in their hands, which easily turned into aggression. He and Sergei, standing nearby, did what they had been taught in the garden. They breathed together. Breathing is a small thing, but the system worked. 1 breath in, 3, 1 breath out, 6. They repeated it. And when a few people got into the rhythm, the panic subsided a little. Then Maryana came out and suggested a distribution. "Let's bring water at night for the vulnerable. For the ones who can't walk, we'll bring a canister." People agreed. It wasn't a medal for heroism. It was a simple agreement that later saved several plants and several nerves. At the end of the third day without normal water, they gathered around a large basin of cold tea and shared empty bowls. Sergei raised his cup, looked at Alexei, and said simply, "We used to think that strength meant not showing weakness. Now I see that strength means lifting the bucket together." His voice faltered a little. It was a turning point. Let the drought continue. Let there be more days when the earth cries for rain and hearts ache. But when an old friend who used to keep to himself reaches out and takes a shovel, when neighbors are ready to share their last bottle, it's no longer about just saving a pot.
It was the salvation of the community from exhaustion. And in this simple, sparse interaction, something was born that could survive the greatest droughts: human resilience, a little water, and a little more willingness to give the last drop.
She appeared in the crowd unexpectedly, as if memory itself had decided to come and bear witness. The hat lay in her hands, washed, neatly folded, but with the same wool scars that remembered the night. When Mariana handed it to him, time seemed to stand still. People held their breath, and even the wind seemed to decide to wait for his answer. They stood on a small stage in front of the Human Potential Center, a space that a year ago had just been a dream, now filled with people, those she had saved with a spoonful of earth, neighbors who had shared water, veterans with the same wrinkles as Sergi. It felt like the city had come to say, "We see you." And he stood there in simple clothes, with old skin on his hands, and felt something tighten under his ribs, not just fear, but the importance of the moment. He took the hat carefully, with hands that had learned to hold a spoon and a bucket, not a weapon. The wool was warm, not from his brother's body, but from Mariana's hands, which had carried it all this time. People were watching. Some crossed themselves, some wiped tears from their eyes, and some smiled quietly, remembering how small things had saved their days. He felt that the hat was not just fabric. It was a key that unlocked the door to nights that had to be remembered, but not allowed to possess him. He put the speech in his head on hold for a second, and just breathed. Breathing was important. They taught him that from the first lesson. 1, 2, 3. Exhale for 6. The rhythm affected his heart. It slowed down so much that when he started to speak, his voice was soft at first, then firm. "I never thought," he began quietly, "that memory could be both a burden and a guide. We hide our wounds because we think we are protecting ourselves, and then we forget how to breathe." He smiled, and in that smile there was room for irony and tenderness. People laughed with him, with laughter that did not ease the pain, but relieved the excess tension. He continued, "This hat is not just a thing. It smelled of the lack of night. It preserved my brother's laughter. I wore it as a shield, because I was afraid that without it, I would become someone who couldn't bear the memory. But here among you, I realized that protection is not always about denying pain. Sometimes true protection is giving up what seems to be the last thing you have in order to learn to live again." People listened, and every word seemed to be reinforced by the light of the evening sun falling on the roof of the center. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Thank you!" And it was not just praise, but a response from the heart. He talked about that night, briefly, without unnecessary details, but with a sincerity that brought tears, not because of the drama, but because of the shared experience. He talked about his brother who laughed when the sky fell, about the hat that smelled like cookies, about the hours when he couldn't get out of bed. And more importantly, he talked about how a spoonful of earth, a word of gratitude, and working together gave him back a part of his life. He said, "They told me, find a doctor, procedures, pills, and that's important. But sometimes
treatment is a cup of tea that gives your heart time to stop trembling. Sometimes, treatment is a person who comes with a pot and says, "I'll take your hat and give you a ritual in return." And sometimes, it's you who came today and will bring water to those who are tired. His voice grew stronger. He was no longer talking only about himself. His words grew into a collective command to remember, to act, to give. He spoke of a center that would not be a hospital, but a home for those who had lost their way. He spoke of a system that taught people to breathe and work, not wait for miracles. As his speech drew to a close, he raised his cap above his head, not as a military salute, but as a gift. And then something happened that he had never imagined. People raised their hands and began to applaud. And it was not applause for him, but applause for the opportunity that was being born among them. Shirji, who was standing to the side, wiped his eyes with his palm. Next to him sat a woman who once couldn't get out of bed. Now she was holding a small sprout in her hands. "I don't know where to put this hat," he laughed quietly. "Maybe in a museum of bad habits. But to be honest, I want it to be here." And he pointed to the center as a reminder. We don't forget. We remember and we build our lives on this memory. Then he sat down because his arms were tired and let people come closer. Someone pressed the hat to their chest as a symbol that everyone has their own story. Someone touched it childishly and smiled, and Maryana quietly sat down next to him and put her hand on his shoulder. A simple touch that spoke louder than words. As evening fell and the light from the lamps broke the shadows, he looked at the people and thought that memory is not a prison, but a map. A map that shows where we have been, so that we know where to go. And the hat that had been returned was no longer just a piece of wool. It had become a symbol of an agreement. I give, you help. You give, someone else can live again. As people dispersed, some continued to converse quietly about gardens, lessons, and how to remember to breathe. He stood and watched as the hat that once hid the pain now shone in the light as a sign that memories can be kept without allowing them to destroy one's life. And that was the loudest voice on that stage, not his, but of all those whose hands made this day possible.